Good morning, everybody. Welcome to. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this FTA webinar on Brexit, the latest developments. Very pleased that you're able to join us this morning. My name is James Hookham. I'm FTA's Deputy Chief Executive, and I'll be hosting and leading the webinar for the next 30 minutes or so. Joining me this morning is our Head of European Policy and in charge in our Brussels office, Pauline Bastidon. And I'm also joined by Heidi Skinner, our Manager of Public Affairs with particular responsibility for policy in the southeast of England, which we will be covering at the end of the webinar. The agenda for today is to update you on the very significant developments that happened in Brussels last week that I'm sure you've all read about and heard about, and try to interpret those from the point of view of an FTA member and its particular implications for supply chain and logistics. We need to try to understand what happens next and what needs to happen next in order to get the kind of outcomes and solutions that members are looking for. And there are also some important actions that we feel members ought to be taking in preparation for either contingency that might emerge. And so we'll start to lift the lid on where we think you can be helping yourselves in order to prepare for Brexit. FTA staff have been extremely busy over the past few weeks, covering the issues and developments in Brussels as well as in London, where there have been important developments in the House of Commons, and also down in Kent. And we'll update you on the arrangements that we think might be prevailing as regards the Operation Stack situation. There are some events and activities for you to look out for from FTA over the next few weeks, and we'll give you a quick heads up on those at the end of the event. So just a quick reminder on these house rules. I think we are gathering a nice following on these webinars, but just to remind you on what the arrangements are. Please would you keep your microphones off, muted. We are recording the webinar and it will be available for download subsequently on the FTA website. And although we're very much welcoming your questions on the content of the webinar, unfortunately we won't be able to help deal with any technical issues, but do please let us know about them as we'll try to resolve them on future occasions. We have a chat box dialogue available on the webinar software, so please do enter your questions through that system. They will be broadcast live to us here at the office, and we will endeavour to answer your questions live as they come in. And if we don't manage to have time to finish that, we will certainly get back to you within a few days. Make sure you have answers to the questions you ask. So please do use that facility to lodge any points you particularly want to make or raise any other questions you want to do with us. So let's get this webinar underway. The big question is, what exactly did happen then last Friday in Brussels? What was actually agreed, and what does it mean for supply chains and logistics? Pauline, please take us through what you think actually happened and emerged from that famous handshake between Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker.
Thanks, James. So basically last Friday, Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker gave a joint press conference to announce that an agreement had finally been found on the situation of Ireland. Ireland was really the last and biggest hurdle, in fact, in the negotiations after the issue of the financial settlement, which had been settled somehow previously. There were still a few issues to resolve on citizens' rights, but all in all, the most problematic issue at that point was Ireland. So this is good news, because this agreement paves the way for a potential move to trade and transition discussions after the European Council meeting of the 15th of December. So in practice, what happened is that both camps adopted a joint report which summarizes the points agreed between the two camps on citizens' rights, Ireland, the financial settlement and other separation issues, such as, for instance, what happens to goods that have market authorization before Brexit, and to commercial contracts on Brexit Day. I think at this point it's fair to tell members that this is just a political report, so it's more a gentleman's agreement, if you want. It's not binding, and it's only the first step in what is likely to be a very long negotiation process. So all elements of this agreement will have to be integrated in the binding agreement, which will be called the withdrawal agreement, which will in turn have to be ratified by both the UK and the EU27 side before Brexit in order to become binding and to provide the clarity to businesses. So basically there's still a very, very long way to go. If we move to the next slide, then you can see a bit of an update on where we are with the state of play of negotiations. So as you might remember, the EU side refused to deal with all topics and said that instead they just wanted to focus on the withdrawal arrangements, the most pressing matters for an orderly withdrawal to start with a particular focus on citizens, financial settlement, and Ireland. So on citizens' rights, what was agreed? Well, the agreement would only cover the rights of EU citizens who legally reside in the UK at a specified date, so that could either be Brexit Day, which is the 29th of March 2019, or if a transition period is agreed, it would be the end of the transition period. It also covers their family members, including future family members and frontier workers. All EU citizens that would want to move to the UK after Brexit or after the end of the transition period, if one is agreed, will not be protected by the agreement, and they will therefore be subject to future immigration laws and rules that have yet to be designed by the UK government. All EU citizens that have gained permanent residence rights will lose them if they leave the UK for more than 5 consecutive years. So they will be able, of course, to travel to the EU or elsewhere if they have to, for work-related reasons, for instance, but then if they are absent for more than 5 years, they will lose these rights. Otherwise, the rights will be pretty much the same as what they have today. So if you have EU nationals already that you employ in your companies, you should still be able to employ them in exactly the same way and on the same terms that you're employing them today. The qualifications of EU and UK citizens that are covered by the agreement will be mutually recognized. However, there is no guarantee regarding the mutual recognition of qualifications obtained post-Brexit or that would be obtained by EU and UK citizens not covered by the agreement. So if, for instance, you were looking after Brexit and the transition period, if there is one, to recruit a driver from Germany or Poland or France, there is no guarantee that the qualifications will be recognized, and likewise, someone with UK qualifications after Brexit that would want to move to the EU would not have, at this point, the guarantee that their qualifications would be recognized. This is seen as a priority for the UK government. It's a point on which FTA has insisted very strongly, and this is going to be dealt with in the second phase of negotiations. On Ireland and Northern Ireland, well, the agreement recognizes the willingness from all sides to protect the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, and the common travel area. And in terms of how a hard border will be avoided on the island of Ireland, 3 options were set out. The first one is the UK's preferred option, to try and deal with it through the overall EU-UK relationship, but that might prove a bit difficult because the UK wants to leave the customs union and the single market, which has implications in terms of customs checks, conformity checks, sanitary checks, and so on. The second option, if that doesn't work, is for the UK to propose specific solutions to address the unique situation of Ireland, although no details are provided at this point on what these solutions might be. And if everything else fails, then the UK will maintain full alignment with the rules of the internal market and the customs union, which supports the cooperation on the island of Ireland, the economy on the island of Ireland, and the protection of the 1998 agreement. There are clearly a lot of things that will have to be defined at this point, not least what full alignment actually means. We don't yet have the clarity needed, unfortunately, but hopefully this is something that will come with the second phase of negotiations. There were a few other points that were covered at this stage, for instance, in terms of cooperation in civil and commercial matters, so what happens to a contract, for instance, or the choice of courts and litigation processes after withdrawal. There were also discussions on goods that have been placed on the market pre-Brexit. No discussions yet, however, on data flows, intellectual property issues, or most importantly for members, customs-related matters for goods that are already in transit at the point of Brexit. So these are things that will have to be tackled in the second phase of negotiations. Talking about the second phase, if everything goes well and on Friday EU leaders decide that they want to move on to transition and trade, then the process will start with transitional measures. They will have to be limited in time. We will be pressing the point that we absolutely need them by March 2018, and we will not be the only ones because business needs clarity. We think that this is going to start fairly soon in the new year, and the EU has already expressed some red lines, which for them basically they are okay with the idea of a transition period, but the full body of EU rules and regulations still need to be respected by the UK, and most importantly, new rules and regulations that would be agreed during the transition period would have to be also respected, and freedom of movement would have to continue during the transitional period, as well as membership of the customs union and the single market. After that, there will be some discussions to prepare the trade discussions for future UK-EU relationship. That's likely to start in the second quarter of next year. And the comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU will only be concluded post-Brexit, hopefully within the time period 2019-2021.
Okay, so we are looking for some clarity still around some really important issues, Pauline. Clearly this is a political agreement, as you said. A lot of the important detail required for business planning and preparation of formal plans still eludes us. Just take us through what we're looking for through the next steps as this process comes out of Christmas and moves into the new year.
Yes, so if we go to the next slide, please. So basically the key milestone, of course, is the meeting of EU 27 leaders. They are expected to give the green light to move to phase 2 of the talks, which will then pave the way, hopefully, for a transition. The transition, well, we're hoping that this will be concluded, as I said, by March 2018, although it might take a bit longer than that. And the framework for the future relationship, what do we mean by that? Well, basically, it will be a sort of preparatory document that will give an indication as to where both camps want to go in terms of trade, transport, customs, and other areas for cooperation. The withdrawal agreement is really going to be the main product of the Article 50 negotiations. It will be binding once agreed, of course, and that's really what's going to tell you exactly what happens to the EU workers that you are currently employing, for instance, what happens to the border on the island of Ireland, but also what happens in terms of the transition period and what that will mean exactly to you. While this is not going to be fully approved until possibly the last minute before Brexit, we will have, in principle, a lot of clarity as to what to expect and what the rules are likely to be beforehand, because, of course, the intention is to finalize the discussions and the negotiations on it by October 2018. So at that point, we should really have a very good idea of what's likely to happen. And as we said, yes, post-Brexit, that would be the trade deal itself, but hopefully we should have already an indication of what will be covered in this trade deal and what the future relationship is going to look like well before Brexit.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Pauline. So really this leaves us not a great deal further forward as a business community, looking at an industry, looking for clarity from, excuse me, looking for clarity from government. So where are we in terms of what we should be doing as regards our planning at this stage? Well, it all depends on whether you see this as being a pessimistic scenario or an optimistic scenario. So a frowny face and smiley face situation. I think the worst case scenario that we're still contemplating is what is commonly called a no-deal Brexit, simply a situation where EU negotiations with the UK stall or simply ended prematurely because it's realised that agreement will not be reached. That could still come at any stage, and certainly our early contacts with government this week have revealed that a no-deal option is still on the table. It is still possible that despite what was discussed and agreed in Brussels last week, that the UK could still leave the EU without a trade agreement. If that is the case, then Brexit will take place at midnight on the 30th of March, Central European time, which of course is 1 hour earlier in the UK, so 11 PM on the 29th of March. And presumably from that time, from that date and time, UK-EU trade becomes conducted under the WTO rules and tariffs. So it certainly means a customs border goes into place, and the precise duties and tariffs which become payable from that point will need to be calculated and worked out, but it will certainly be under a no-deal scenario an important threshold which will have been crossed. Possibly of more delay and potential disruption to supply chains, though, won't just be the simple imposition of customs tariffs. It will be the ending of the mutual recognition of the conformity standards and certifications which currently prevail across the single market. So whereas at the moment, for example, consignments of food dispatched from the UK to elsewhere in the European Union will be inspected by a Food Standards Agency inspector and signed off and sealed against EU standards. The fact that that FSA approval or seal will be recognised elsewhere in the single market will end upon Brexit, and therefore the rest of the European Union will be expecting to conduct its own checks on that food shipment at the border. And it's the imposition of those checks, the time delays and the disruption to movements that will bring about the queues and the other delays that have been talked about, particularly on the Dover-Calais crossing. That is an unfortunate consequence of the decision to leave the single market as well as the customs union. But one of the things that we need to recognise is that doesn't just impose a requirement on UK authorities to introduce customs checks and border arrangements. Of course, it requires other agencies in the EU to do likewise. And certainly the FTA has been very active just recently, making sure that French and Belgian, Dutch and Spanish and of course Irish customs are fully aware that they will need to implement hopefully very efficient and nevertheless thought through and prepared border arrangements on their side. This isn't just something that has got to be left to the UK authorities. So that's an important recognition that we need to get through to EU governments as well, because they need to be ready for a no-deal Brexit just as much as the UK government does. On the other side, though, there is a smiley face scenario, which was most recently presented to the House of Commons by the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, David Davis, and he was presenting to them a few weeks ago now, before the outcome of the talks last week in Brussels. But effectively, his predicted scenario for Brexit presumed upon the green light for trade talks to commence being given at the EU summit later this week. And he promised the House of Commons Brexit Committee that by the end of the first quarter of 2018, he would be presenting to the House of Commons an outline trade deal, a framework which defined in broad terms the kind of relationship that the UK would have with the European Union going forward. Now, this looks as if it might actually have slipped in terms of the timeline that Pauline was talking about until possibly the second quarter of 2018, but absolutely crucially, this does need to contain the clarity we need about the length of the transition arrangements, because it's unlikely that all of the preparations will have been completed in time by 2019. Under David Davis's scenario, a final Brexit agreement would be presented to the UK Parliament and to the European Parliament by October 2018. And certainly Michel Barnier seemed to be talking about this timeline in some of his statements last Friday. So if things do go well, this does look to be a credible timeline. That will give sufficient time for the UK and European Parliaments to discuss and debate and, importantly, vote on the deal. Certainly both need to be in concurrence in order for this deal to go through. If it does, it's still expected that Brexit will still take place on at midnight on the 30th of March 2019, Central European time, and that certainly under David Davis's scenario, he would have a new UK-EU trade deal ready to be implemented immediately afterwards. So he said a nanosecond afterwards. We've given him the benefit of the doubt and said that it'll actually go into force at a minute past midnight on the 30th of March 2019. Now, this is probably the most optimistic scenario, and already those timings are probably being brought into question by the outcome of last week. But it's important to realise that even though there are some formidable barriers to ensuring supply chain continuity that lie ahead, there is certainly an optimistic scenario that the government foresees, and that we at the FTA in turn are certainly encouraging them towards, because even though we might not think it particularly likely, it's important that we do maximise the chances of a smiley face scenario and the least possible disruption to supply chains as we actually go through Brexit. So in following that up, we are promoting very vigorously now with the UK government and indeed with the European institutions our free trade framework checklist. So these are the elements, these are the matters that we feel need to be urgently clarified in the forthcoming negotiations, so that the framework for the free trade agreement that David Davis promised by the end of March contains these matters as an absolute minimum. So first of all, we need to be clear and have confirmed which customs classification system we will be working to, and ideally what tariffs and duty rates and the VAT rates that will be imposed, because that will give exporters and importers a chance to begin the quite significant process of classifying their products that they sell into the rest of the EU according to the customs nomenclature, and starting to work out exactly what the duties and excise that they will have to pay, and obviously the resultant impact on the prices that they are going to be offering customers. That's quite a fair bit of homework for industry to do. The sooner we get clarity on that, the sooner that commences, and that can certainly be going on as an exercise in the background whilst the other political negotiations are taking place. So we think that we are getting close to some kind of statement on certainly the customs classification system, which shouldn't be too different to what we already have in the European Union. We just need it to be that formally confirmed, and businesses can begin that process, and we will certainly be keeping you all informed on developments there. As I said earlier, the big potential disruption to border transit will be the need to conduct conformity checks. Certainly in our own discussions and conversations with Michel Barnier's task force that's been conducting the negotiations on the EU side, they made it very clear that the EU would be expecting to impose sanitary and phytosanitary controls from day one, from midnight on the first day of Brexit, and therefore this is a really important issue because of the potential disruption to free-flowing traffic, plus the pressure that it puts on port areas to find the space to actually conduct these checks. So we need to know whether these checks will be imposed from the first day of Brexit, or whether there will be some kind of transitional period where the current certifications and approvals are continue to be recognised and the current arrangements are rolled over for the duration of the transitional period. And this is really important because government agencies themselves need to know what they need to start to be spending money on and be setting up preparation for, and whether ports will need to be able to find space to accommodate these kinds of checks on vehicles. And of course, vehicle operators will then need to be able to work out which documentation they will need to be presenting at the border as part of these checks. And of course, they will need to get that documentation from importers and exporters so they can give it to their drivers. So there's a lot of parties that are involved in navigating these new border checks should they come in. So it's really crucial that we get some clarity and some decisions made about what exactly is going to be taking place at the border on Brexit Day, so that these various lines of communication can be set up and the necessary arrangements begin to be made. Ideally, of course, it will all be rolled over and continue as it is now, at least for the duration of the transitional period. But at this point in time, we don't know that, and therefore conformance certifications and mutual recognition of conformity checks remains the biggest potential disruptor to supply chains so far as the movement of freight is concerned. Equally, and possibly even more challenging to the smooth flow of goods and vehicles across the border is the no small matter of the availability of permits, as the automatic rights of vehicles to cross the border in an unlimited number of times will disappear upon the loss of the community licence, which will come about with the withdrawal of the UK from the single market. So we are putting a huge amount of pressure, particularly on the Department of Transport, to come forward with their proposals as to how the arrangements will work for the continued passage of the current number of vehicles across the border, and whether or not there will need to be a new permit system in place, and if so, how that will work, simply because the current permit arrangements were last used in 1993, and clearly the volume of trade has increased dramatically since then, and the old arrangements simply will not work. As Paul has already mentioned, there is the small matter of the qualifications of drivers in particular continuing to be recognised. This is particularly around the driver CPC, so that after Brexit, UK awarded driver CPC qualifications, in other words, driver qualification cards issued by DVLA to British trained drivers, will continue to be recognised by the other governments in the European Union, in the EU 27, so that even though you've got your freight cleared through customs and you may have your vehicle has got permission to travel across the border, you don't want the whole thing coming to a complete halt because all of a sudden the driver's qualification isn't recognised. So these four essential factors are top of FTA's list at this time as we go into the next round of conversations and negotiations with government. We urgently need to get those sorted out because they could have real significant disruptive effect on trade and could bring quite significant costs and red tape onto the international transport industry. Paul, will you tell us a little bit more about these issues? Take us through these in a little bit more detail, because they are really going to be featuring in a big way in our discussions with government in the next few months.
Thank you, James. So yes, I mean the implications of a new deal for trade, which is the next slide, are pretty significant indeed. If you don't have anything to replace the existing arrangements, and you would see the return of tariffs, which are not negligible, of course, and can become a big part of the price of your product. You could see a return of red tape and regulatory barriers. As you mentioned, controls, which would result in longer lead times for importers and exporters, as well as disruptions on the border on both sides, with traffic delays. The Port of Dover famously said that it currently takes about 2 minutes to process a truck through the Port of Dover, an EU truck through the Port of Dover. If we were in a post-Brexit situation where there are going to be some kind of controls at the border, any extra 2 minutes per truck would result in 17 miles of queues. So obviously this is something we're very actively aware of, and so is government, because Dover estimated it could lead to operation stack being in place at least once a week. So that's clearly something we want to avoid, and I'll tell you how we think we can avoid it in a few minutes. The cost to business and lack of time to adapt would really be a very bad outcome as well, and that's why we're pressing for a transition period to give everyone some time to adapt to new rules and to the world post-Brexit. But equally, there will be consequences for authorities as well, both in terms of IT systems. Of course, you might know, if you're interested in customs, that there will be a new customs declaration system to replace Chief for the customs declarations. Will it be ready on time? What about border staff? And that's very much the case on both sides of the border. Are the French, the Belgian, or Dutch governments, for instance, going to be able to recruit a sufficient amount of border staff, including customs officials? And then there is the not trivial aspect of lack of space at major nodes. Of course, this is the case for Dover, but not only. It's very much the case for Eurotunnel, and it's very much the case for channel ports on the French side, for instance. There is, of course, some consequences.
Go ahead.
There is, of course, some practical consequences for transport, as well as for trade, in case we go into such a scenario. There is no WTO fallback for Ro-Ro, rail and aviation, which is the next slide, please. And what we have been saying, of course, is that besides looking for solutions to the problems related to trade, borders, minimizing delays, and so on, there can be no trade without transport. Market access will be a key challenge for aviation, for Ro-Ro, and for rail. For instance, for Ro-Ro, for road transport, there is no such thing as a free market in international haulage. And the only system which is available for international haulage is a system under OECD called the ECMT permit system, which would cover less than 5% of the needs. So this is clearly not a solution, and we've been being very vocal about this, both in London as well as in Brussels, advocating for something to in fact replicate the existing arrangements for road transport and for the mode of transport. And as you mentioned, there is of course the question mark about mutual recognition of qualifications as well as driver's licenses. So quite a lot of points that would need to be solved, and that would still be there, and that industry would have to face in case of a no deal. And certainly there are certain things that can be done to minimize some of these, and I'll be happy to take you through that in a few minutes.
Okay, so just summarise, Pauline, what we're actually looking for then going through these negotiations in the next few weeks.
So what we're looking for on the next slide, please. We want to see continuation of tariff-free trade. We want to reduce all the non-tariff barriers that are going to create a lot of red tape for importers and exporters as much as possible. And clearly we're saying that we need clarity, absolute clarity on the new trade and regulatory arrangements. What are the rules, the standards that importers and exporters will have to respect? What are the customs processes that everyone will have to adapt to? We're asking for a lot of clarity on this, as well as what the transport companies themselves will need to do. On customs, we have come up with 10 solutions to minimize disruptions at the border, delays at the border, and make sure that the borders, the customs borders anyway, remain as seamless as possible. This publication is on our website, but it includes things such as, of course, avoiding to do the checks at the border whenever possible, and finding other ways of carrying them if they really have to take place. Joining the Common Transit Convention, which will especially help facilitate the process of transit for goods from Ireland to the EU using the GB land bridge, but not only. And there are quite a few other ideas that we have included in this paper, which has been shared with government as well as the task force of Michel Barnier. On transport, we are asking basically for arrangements at EU level between the EU and the UK instead of bilateral agreements that will replicate the existing access. So protecting, of course, the international transport, making sure there is no rationing, no permits in place if we can, and that cabotage remains allowed within the limits that are set in law today. For workers, we're very acutely aware that logistics relies extensively on EU workers in the UK, and we want to make sure that government is aware of the specificities of the logistics sector in this case. For instance, the fact that we still rely extensively on agency workers that might not be based full-time all year round in the UK, and make sure that both the arrangements for those EU workers that currently live in the UK, as well as the ones that might have to be employed by the logistics sector post-Brexit, are still able to work without difficulties in the UK, and that the sector is still able to access the talents it needs, regardless of where they come from. So these are really the key things that we're looking at for the deal, essentially, and that's what we're calling for both in London and Brussels.
Okay, so that's what FTA is going to be doing. What are we advising members should now be doing, Pauline? Take us through the ideas that we've got for there.
So there are a few things that you can do internally to start with. Of course, I think a lot of companies now have an internal Brexit task force, but in case you don't have one, it's essential that you set one up and that you ensure that on top of human resources, public affairs, or strategy, you also have customs, supply chain and procurement, and logistics that are taken into account. It's very important when you conduct your own impact assessments that you work not just with your colleagues, but also as much as possible with your suppliers, partners and service providers to conduct your SWOT analysis. Why is that? Because you might have a lot of smaller companies in your supply chains. Your transport providers might be quite small companies as well. And in all cases, they perhaps don't have the resources to do this work themselves, and perhaps they haven't really started thinking about it. And you're not perhaps aware of all the limitations and difficulties they could be facing. And you need to be aware of all of this if you want to plan in the best possible way. So if we go to the next slide. In terms of how you can do this internal impact assessment, we would really recommend that you focus on the worst case scenario, the no deal situation. Why? Because that provides you with a plan in case things really don't go as well as everyone is hoping. As I said earlier, unfortunately, there's still a tangible possibility that everything might end up in a much more negative way than we're hoping. So this is not going to be wasted time. You need to map out the impact on your production and supply chain, but also on your market. So think about your consumers as well. Where are they, and what are the implications for them of Brexit? Think about the human resources as well as the tax implications. There will also be implications for VAT, for instance. The regulatory implications, especially if you have highly regulated products such as chemicals or pharmaceuticals. There could be big implications there. And of course you need to know what the impact on your transport providers and transportation choices is as well, because you will not be able to plan all of this at the very last minute if you're faced with a very hard Brexit. And last but not least, try to see if there are any opportunities and if you can actually gain from it. And if you do find some opportunities, as well as if you find threats, obviously. There are also things that you can do externally. On the next slide. You can, of course, stay tuned, and joining things like this webinar, for instance, is an important part of the process. But of course, you can also be active and voice your concerns towards the UK government and your local MPs, other national governments, if you're established in other EU member states, as well as the equivalent of your MPs and regional authorities in these other countries. You can voice your concerns towards FTA, of course. Always make sure that you highlight the practical impact of political decisions, because the process is very political at the moment, but we really have to take it to the ground and really have to take it to the practical details. And last but not least, it's very important that you work with us on concrete solutions so that we are able to help you in the best possible way.
Okay, so we've been very active in recent weeks trying to promote this agenda that we've been describing to various parties in Brussels, in London and elsewhere. Pauline, starting in Brussels, what has been our priority there? Where have we been particularly active and what have we been trying to achieve?
So in Brussels, we've really targeted all the main decision makers and policy makers involved in this process. Especially, of course, the task force of Michel Barnier, because they are the actual negotiators. But more widely, also, we've had quite a lot of contacts with members of the European Parliament. Well, you were invited, of course, as part of this process 3 weeks ago to provide evidence to the Transport Committee of the European Parliament. There have been quite a lot of other more informal contacts, both with politicians, civil servants, as well as other trade associations and businesses also on a continental basis. And what we've been highlighting throughout is that it's not just a UK issue. Many European companies active in the EU27 are also going to be affected in one way or another, because supply chains are so integrated, because there are so many links, especially, of course, between Ireland and the UK, but not only. In spite of this, I think it's fair to say that Brexit is still largely perceived as a primarily UK issue. So there is still a lot of work to do to convince the EU27 side otherwise. Yet I think that the fact that now the EU side has said, okay, we will prioritize the transition in these discussions is a clear policy win for us. Because that's something we've been calling for a long time. And originally that was just going to be discussed at the end of the process. I think it's important for everyone in the UK to understand what the fears from the other side are. And there is a clear fear of regulatory and social dumping for right or wrong reasons. What has been written in the press, of course, is read widely in Brussels and has given the impression to some that well, the UK is just going to basically get rid of all its standards, social, regulatory, environmental, or otherwise. Of course, that's not the idea, and it's certainly not something that we would caution as FTA, because we think that road safety, for instance, is an absolutely essential thing that has to be protected no matter what. But it's something which is out there, and we have to do a lot of work to reassure everyone in Brussels that this is not the direction things are taking. Another important topic that we're discussing is the level of preparedness on the EU27 side. In terms of customs, we know that it can take years to recruit and train customs officials. We know also that transport could be the forgotten topic in all of this. And as we said, there is no trade without transport, so it's essential that we ensure that importers and exporters can rely on good transport links post-Brexit. And there is still a lot of need for guidance, of course, from authorities. Now, we know that a number of member states have already started and made quite a lot of progress on some of these points. So, for instance, the Netherlands have a customs impact assessment and are devising some plans to cope with Brexit. They are going to be providing some guidance to traders, and we understand that Belgium is going to do the same thing. France is still a bit unclear, but there was an announcement last week that they would recruit more customs officials, and they have a good, I mean, the customs authorities there have a good relationship with industry, so hopefully they will also be providing some guidance. What we've learned is that the European Commission, the task force of Michel Barnier, would be looking at potentially providing more guidance to traders when possible. It's already been done in specific sectors, so there are some guidance documents available if, for instance, you're dealing with fresh produce or pharmaceuticals, but it's still very much work in progress, and that's something on which we're really encouraging them to work faster, because that sort of documents, that sort of guidance are essential to help business to plan.
Okay, well that's great, but of course there is much waiting for the outcome of transitional deals and just how hard a Brexit it's going to be in order to understand just how much they've got to prepare as well. But it's important they realise it's not just a British activity. Thank you very much indeed, Pauline. Now, of course, it's all been go in the UK Parliament as well. So Heidi, just take us through the various activities that we've been monitoring and influencing back home in London.
Yes, thank you, Jane. So I think it's been very clear that it hasn't necessarily been seamless and frictionless for UK legislation, most specifically the EU withdrawal bill, where Theresa May has been coming up against some quite severe opposition from some senior Tories. So it's been a difficult time there, but we're obviously watching that as it progresses very quickly through the House of Commons. We're expecting the committee, obviously it's back in the Commons today for committee stages, and we're expecting that to conclude by the 20th of December, before obviously it goes on to the report stage and the third reading. But yes, there will be a number of different amendments. The use of the Henry VIII powers, which is quite contentious, but obviously a lot of guarantees that some of the Remainers want to see into that particular piece of legislation. So we're watching that as well as the trade and the customs bills, which we have been monitoring very closely. And as part of that, part of our awareness raising of members' issues, we have been committing to a number of different select committee consultations, which we know has been very important as part of our awareness raising within government, and specifically highlighting some of the custom issues. In particular, we've committed to the Northern Ireland inquiry, Northern Ireland Select Inquiry, I should say, on land borders between Northern Ireland and Ireland. We were specifically asked to give evidence to the EU Select Committee on the progress of the UK's negotiations on the EU withdrawal, of which James obviously you gave evidence to, which was a very good committee session, plus the House of Lords Brexit deal or no deal. So that has all, we know, has been very good for influencing government and ensuring that amendments have been taken on board with regards to that legislation. Obviously also worth noting that next year we will see the transport bill published, which will cover the permits for international haulage and trade registration. We do have some roundtables with Secretary of State and Transport Ministers coming weeks, so that's a very important time for us to actually be working with both the ministers and the civil servants to ensure that that piece of legislation is correct for members. So yeah, that will be taking place, as I said, before Christmas.
Okay, so that's what's happening in Brussels and in London. Another major hub of political activity just recently has been a little bit closer to home. Stanford in Kent was in the news for all sorts of reasons. Heidi, just take us through what the really serious implications of this are for Brexit and members' operations.
Yeah, so as Pauline mentioned earlier, obviously one of the implications that of a no deal is that Operation Stack will come back into play. Obviously, I'm sure most people are aware of the summer of 2015, when Operation Stack was in place on the M20 in Kent. As a result of that, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, outlined in his autumn statement that money would be put forward for a lorry park just off the M20 to make sure that this never happened again. Unfortunately, this is progressing very slowly, and actually in the last few weeks the plans were withdrawn from the Department of Transport. They were fighting official review. So actually we are now back at square one. But the Department of Transport, Highways England have said they're both committed to finding a solution. But what that does mean is that we will not have anything in place for our exit from the EU, and obviously the implications that that has for any delays at Dover or the Channel Tunnel. We're aware obviously that consultation will take place next year with an eye on the Department submitting a planning application in 2019. Now the worry is that the backup option will be Manston Airport. From those obviously you can see on the screen, that is a long way away from the M20, so the implications for traffic to be held at Manston Airport rather than what was obviously envisaged at Stamford West is quite different, and the impacts that that will have on the other parts of the road network will be significant. Now, the government do not talk about this option, but it is, and it has been mentioned in a number of Kent County Council and Department of Transport meetings, this is the backup option. But what they also want to do in the interim is to allow motorists to keep using the M20. So they are now potentially looking at having movable steel barriers in place as early as next year. We don't know anything yet as to what that will look like and how that will be operated, but that is something that we're taking a very, very keen look at to see how this will work and what their ideas are. So we will be keeping you abreast of those details as when we have them.
But this is definitely a step backwards in the sense that one possible source of relief for drivers has been denied them by the withdrawal of this planning application.
Yeah, no, it was. It did come as a shock to us, and it is something that we are concerned about. Okay.
Well, that is certainly a topic that we will be raising with the Department for Transport next week amongst the meetings that Heidi mentioned. There's a few other things that are happening that we'd just like to brief you on. We've now started to issue a weekly Brexit digest summarising the various political and operational developments that we become aware of each week. Please do let us know if you wish to receive that. We believe it's being distributed to all members at present, but if you're not seeing your own copy, please do contact us and let us know, and we will ensure you get one direct. So that will be happening from now on, and it will be the best way of keeping yourselves informed as to the various developments that FTA becomes aware of, and through that means we will also highlight any other activities that you may be interested in. As Heidi mentioned, we've got a particularly important series of meetings coming up in the next few days. A really important round table with the Secretary of State for Transport, Chris Grayling, tomorrow, at which we expect to hear an update on the vehicle permit situation, and certainly FTA will be raising the Operation Stack situation as well and asking for an update on the department's plans there. Next week we have a further meeting with Transport Minister John Hayes, and also importantly Robin Walker, who's a junior minister at the Department for Exiting the EU. FTA's Chief Executive and its President will be meeting both individuals and pressing our agenda for the issues that we want resolved in the next round of negotiations. FTA has also been invited to give evidence to a House of Lords committee examining UK-Irish relations, particularly in the context of trade and cross-border activity. And although we haven't covered it much in this webinar, there are clearly profound implications for operations in Ireland, and that they will be critically affected by the nature of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. In addition, of course, there are also the issues of the capacity of the British and Irish ports to be able to handle the new arrangements and border activities as well. We're planning a further event in Brussels on Brexit. We'll give you more details on those as that date becomes confirmed, but an opportunity for FTA members to influence directly opinion formers and decision makers in Brussels, and that will be at some point in March. Well, thank you very much indeed for your attention. I'm not sure if we have any questions, but if there's any particular points that you do want to raise with us, please do feel free to use the dialogue boxes on the webinar software now, or indeed make contact with us, and we will arrange we'll be happy to try to answer any questions that you have. We will advise dates for future webinars throughout 2018, as we believe that these continue to be to find value with members, and judging by the numbers that are participating, we certainly intend to continue, and we will advise those dates in due course. Okay, so we have one question submitted through the webinar system, so thanks very much to Andy here. Question is, what implications do you see in both scenarios for non-commercial movements of goods, for example, equipment for touring bands moving into the EU and returning to the UK? Well, that's a good question. Yes, indeed, a number of our members ensure that the rest of Europe gets to see acts like the Rolling Stones and the other best of British pop and contemporary music, and no doubt other fine parts of British culture and the performing arts. So we are very familiar with this. I'm particularly aware that these kind of tours do cause immense problem for customs, because they can't quite understand why the goods that left the country at one point then return completely untouched a few weeks later. We have no specific clarity on exactly what the status of these goods will be. All I can say, Andy, is that we have certainly lodged this as an issue that needs to be included in the considerations for cross-border movements. It's probably a little bit too fine in the detail for us to be able to cover quite at this point, but this is the kind of trade and certainly the kind of earning activity, wealth-producing activity, that the government does need to understand is actually conducted across the borders, and that it certainly needs to continue to provide arrangements for in any post-Brexit scenario. Now, I suspect this will be as much a matter for dialogue over with the European EU27 customs agencies as much as HMRC. So although I can't give you a great deal of information at the moment, please rest assured that it is firmly on our agenda. I suspect that under a no-deal scenario, we will have to be looking to make special provisions, very much negotiated at the time, but it will need to be included in the appropriate customs arrangements in the longer term, so that you clearly don't end up having to pay duty on what is effectively equipment for conduct of your particular trade. So thank you for that question. And rest assured that we've got that on our agenda. Getting some questions coming in thick and fast now, so we'll just get through these as quickly as we can. Question from David, how good or bad would fallback on WTO rules be? Well, I'm going to invite Pauline to offer a comment on that, because you were telling me a few days ago, Pauline, that actually there isn't a single set of tariffs, a single set of rules for WTO. It all depends. Would you like to say some comments on that?
Yes, so WTO basically provides a framework for trade, but exactly there are no, we often talk about WTO tariffs and rules. That does not really exist as such. So yes, there are overarching rules on how to treat your trade partners, so that's basically how a country needs to define their tariff structure and so on, and the fact that if you don't have a trade deal or some kind of integration with other countries, for instance being part of the EU, you need to treat all your partners in the same way as a country. So what that means is that the EU, in that case, would be forced to impose the external tariffs that are in place for the so-called most favored nation, which are basically, the full tariffs. And these would have to be paid, of course, by UK exporters looking to export in the EU. If you are importing from a tariff point of view, that will very much depend on what the UK government decides to do, but we understand that they intend to replicate the tariff structure that's currently in place at EU level. So assuming that this is going ahead, indeed, it would be pretty much the same thing, tariff-wise. Of course, they would have the opportunity to slash tariffs for goods coming from outside of the world, developing countries, for instance, outside of the EU, sorry, developing countries, for instance. They could replicate the existing GSP Plus and everything but arms schemes. In terms of the rules, regulations, sanitary checks, conformity checks, and so on, I'm sorry to say that under a WTO scenario, the full package of rules that would apply for trade between so-called third countries and the EU would have to apply to the UK as well. So to give you some examples, if you are looking to trade meat, for instance, there is a requirement under EU law to have physical checks on 20% at least of beef, pork and lamb, and 50% of all poultry products. So this is just an example, but similar sort of things would have to be in place for plant-based products or wood packaging, for instance. And then in terms of transport, that's the big question, because as I said earlier, there is no WTO fallback for transport. So there would have to be new agreements. If there are no agreements, it's going to be very difficult. And I know that both sides really understand that. So we will keep pushing, but we don't envisage a situation whereby there would be no new agreement for transport, because that would massively restrict the amount of trade that could take place.
Well, thanks very much, Pauline. Yes, it would be a real mess if we have to resort to a no-deal arrangements. Brexit, it is still a prospect that we have to take seriously, despite last week's outcomes, and certainly the government is still planning for that as an option, and it is still prominent in all their thinking. Now, clearly, we would have to step up considerably the level of communication to members if that became the realistic outcome. We will have a clearer idea as to what the prospects are for a deal or no deal outcome as soon as the end of this week, when, as you heard, the next stage in the political process takes place. That's the formal meeting of the European Council, the meeting of the 27 heads of state, who will formally give the green light, we hope, and they expect to be able to give the go-ahead to trade talks to start, and then we can start to get into some of the detail that we've been discussing during the course of this webinar. So still lots to do, all to play for, and we'll be keeping you up to speed on what's been going on or how we understand it to be affecting supply chain and logistics through our weekly e-news and through the next one of these webinars, which will take place in January. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for all your questions and your contributions through the chat room. We'll advise the date of the next webinar. But thank you for your attendance today. And on behalf of everybody at the Freight Transport Association, have a very happy Christmas, and we'll speak to you again in the new year. Goodbye now.